Hello, this is Jeff, and this is episode number 2 of the Mystery, a Rustic Mystery series where I'm working on a interactive fiction, text adventure, whatever title you want to apply to games like this. But I'm writing it in Rust, and the exercise here for me is one for design. So this is less about specific syntactic features of Rust, and it's not really a how-to tutorial for Rust per se. This is more about trying to find the best ways to design solutions in Rust, given the way in which Rust functions, the way in which the borrow checker operates, and the constraints of the language. So in our last episode, I originally started with just a main function, and I'm using ncurses, and there's a Rust library that wraps ncurses pretty much at the API level, right? There's a couple of Rustisms in there, but not too many. And I had gotten, um, some basic windowing stuff in ncurses going, but it was pretty minor, right? It was pretty simple, didn't do a whole lot. So in the first episode, we took that code and we refactored it. So we created a couple of structs. We made a header window. So a header window has a game title, a room name, a score, the number of moves you've made, the max X position and the max Y position, and then the window handle for ncurses. And then the implementation on the header window, we have a constructor that makes a new header window. We have a function that sets the room name on the header window. And we have a function that increments the number of moves you've made. And we have an update that uses, again, the ncurses API to display. Now, there's a bug in here, right, where we're calculating the space between the different parts of the window. We need to fix that. Um, so then we also ended up with a story window. So this is the bottom part where the description and your interaction as a player comes in. So this has a max X and Y. Are we seeing a pattern yet? This has a window handle. This has some input, and this has some variables on it that manage user input. It has the room identifier for the room that you're currently in. This embeds the header window in it, composes it, and then we have a hash map of rooms, room identifier, and the actual room itself. Um, and then in the story window, we have a constructor that makes the window and sets up our state. And we have define rooms, and we're going to define rooms. We're going to improve here in an upcoming episode, but we're not going to focus on that quite yet because this is very verbose, and this is going to be kind of painful if we have to do this over and over again this way. Plus, rooms are going to become a bit more complex. So yeah, we're going to refactor all that. We're going to I'd like to try introducing a macro to help us define rooms, but we'll do that in a future episode. And then we have a mutator function that takes a room identifier and sets it on our self. And then we have, look at rooms. So this is kind of like a verb, right? This is an example of a very primitive verb that we've implemented. So we look up the room from the hash map based on the room identifier we have. We try to match that. And if we don't get one, we look up the none room, which is kind of the void room. We set the window header, the name in the window header, and we get a description string, and we manipulate that a bit, and then we put that out there in the story window. So, and this fill, this is a function that comes from this text wrap library that just does some really simple text wrapping for us. Then we've got prompt. So this just writes out the prompt to the story window. And then we've got all the different moves, right? So moving west, east. Well, actually, I think we just implemented west and east last time because those were the only two we had. But north and south would be very similar. And then we have a run method on here. This is the main loop of the game, right? So we update our header window. We look at the room we're in and we do the prompt initially, right? So this is the initial state that comes out in the window. We read a character through ncurses and then we go through and check, right? So the ncurses now at this level is kind of like a terminal. It is a terminal. So we have to deal with terminal type stuff. So we have to handle things like return and cursor keys and home and end keys and delete keys. We have to handle all that stuff explicitly. So most of this code in here is just code that handles that. Now, it's kind of messy. Eventually, we'll try to tidy this up and improve it a bit, but it works for what we're doing right now. So this is less important at the moment. We have an enum for our room identifier. So all the rooms that we'll have a room identifier in the enum. And then our room structure has that identifier, the name, the description, and then it tells each room describes where it can go to, what it links to. So based on the different directions that we can go, where, the different directions we could travel, what room would that take us to in the map? And then on our room impl, we just have a constructor that builds a room. And then our main function is pretty simple. These are calls to ncurses that set up ncurses. We create our header window. We create our story window passing in the header window. We call define rooms on the story window. We set the initial room on the story window and we run it. And then when run exits, we call end win. This cleans up ncurses. So not too bad, but it's kind of an odd grouping. So here are some of the things I'm looking at. Oh, and I suppose I should run this just so we can, kind of review what we have, right? So there's the name of the game, there's the name of the room, the score, and the moves. Then we have this is look at room. I'm in a dark, seedy, and extremely dirty hotel room, and my head is killing me. Right, and so we can say look again, and it will repeat that. It doesn't understand pretty much anything else. We can't go in these directions yet, so we haven't implemented that. But we can go west. So if you look, the name of the room up at the top has changed. So now it says grimy and dark hotels hallway, and moves has incremented by 1, but you'll see we're off. So our code that's computing how to pad that string is not working correctly. So we need to fix that. But and then if I try to go west again, I can't because there's nowhere, we didn't tie that room to anything in that direction. But I can go back east. So I can go back into the grimy and dark hotel room, and that works. And so then we can quit. So that's what we have. So what I would like to do, again, is keep the functionality we have, but just make the refactor the structure so that it's cleaner. Because if we look at header window, we're having to poke into it a lot, right? We're having to poke in the room name. We're having to tell it to increment the moves. Does it really have the move? Or, the move doesn't really belong to the header window. It belongs to the player. So I think what we need to introduce here is the concept of a player. that would be a start. And the player is going to have moves and a score. Um, what is Sea Lion complaining about here? I don't think I typoed it. No. Okay. And the player has a location, right? That's where the player lives at that moment. The other thing that players have is players have an inventory. They have items. So we should introduce the concept of an item. And I think we're going to have an item ID. And I'm just going to borrow. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to retype it. And we're definitely going to have a name on this guy. Yeah, sea lion is a little, oops, wrong thing. So item identifier, I don't know. Let's say that there's a flashlight. All right. So we have that at least. I don't know if we're actually going to end up with a flashlight or not, but it's a fairly common item, right? So what we're going to end up with is in our game, in our story, we're going to end up with a manifest of items, just like we have a manifest of rooms. It'll be a hash map that maps, item identifier to actual items. A player is just going to have a vector of items. Okay, so that'll make sense. So instead of story window, I think we should just call this story interactive story. How about that? Okay. And an interactive story is going to have an items hash map and a rooms hash map. And an interactive story is going to have a player. Oh, got to import it. Oh, and it's not vector, it's vec. um, no. All right, let me vec Oh, right, it's generic. Well, no, that should be fine. What did I typo here? Publistruct vect. Standard vector. Yep. Okay. So now, right. Now we're just back to, we're shuffling things around. Okay. So now I want to fold header window into our interactive story. So score and moves has already moved to player. We want to move game title and room name to our interactive story because, again, like the ownership is clearly here, right? And if there's one thing about Rust that's very clear is, you really want to optimize for ownership because it just makes your life so much easier. So we want to have two windows though. We want to have the header win and we want to have the story win. So we're going to change the name of those handles so that we can track both of them. And I'm kind of obsessive about stacking things in length order. I don't know why. So that eliminates the header window struct. And I'm just going to borrow that code for a second. So when we create our interactive story now, let's just paste this in here. So we don't need these again. We don't need these again. So this simplifies things because there's only one terminal screen. There's only one main ncurses window. We only need to get max X and Y once. We don't need to get it multiple times. And we don't need to pass the header window in anymore. Right, so you can see already how this is kind of simplifying things. And we're just going to, instead of define rooms, we're going to have a method called Initialize that just does everything. We probably need to define the items first. All right, so for now, define items will be empty, but we're slowly structuring it so that we can, by calling Initialize, we get to the right place. Plus, let's take this out. Let's not poke the starting room out from the outside in. Let's do it here. All right. So what would the room, it's just setting self room. So right, because the story is in charge of itself. It knows where it's going to start and where it's going to end and how that's going to happen. So again, thinking about things in terms of ownership, this is making it much clearer And it simplifies things if we're doing it right, where we end up with a lot less at the root. Okay, so now we want to let's take the update function for the header window, and I believe there's an update. Oops, that doesn't render right. I believe there's an update function. Nope. Okay, it's just all being done inside of the run. So we will have a update header function, which happily just ports in here through this refactoring. Instead of doing header window.update, we just call update header. Right, and so instead of header window increment moves, here we just say self player make made move. So we need to put that on player. Right. Okay. So we don't need this anymore. We don't need that. Okay, so there goes that. Now we still have to get the initialization proper on the interactive story. So we have max x, max y. A player, we're going to say is, there's no header window here. Right, so what we want to do here is we want to borrow that, and we want to say header win and story win. And then player is going to be player new. Okay. So we're going to refactor this just be called story, which Sea Lion didn't quite do right. Okay. We'll do it the old-fashioned way. And then this will be story win. Story win. But we also, actually, I think that's pretty good, because if we look at the diff, we weren't doing anything else, right, with the header window. Now that may not be correct, but I think at least to the extent that we're duplicating what we had before, I think that's correct. Room name, right. So, and then we need game title. So game title was string from mystery. Oops. And room name, we defaulted to the void. Ooh. All right. Okay. So we've got max, x, and y. We're going to implement the player stuff here in a minute. We've got the default room name, which I'm thinking this room name field is going to go away. I think we're going to refactor it out. We don't need it, but for the short term, we're going to leave it in here. Just makes the refactoring a little bit easier. Game title, which is mystery. This used to be passed in from main. So now this is nicely encapsulated where it should be. We have the story window and the header window, right? All inside the interactive story. We have our escape sequence for our input parser and stuff. Room, we have the header window. We don't need that anymore, right? So there is no header window anymore. And we have the items map and we have the rooms map. And then in our constructor for our story, we set our max, x, and y. We set our player. We initialize the room. We initialize the item hash map. We initialize our sequences for our parser. We set our initial room, which is none. We get our header window and we get our story window from ncurses. We set our game title and our room name. Okay. We added a function called Initialize. And this calls define items, which right now does nothing. So actually what we should probably do, self items insert. And this should be item identifier flashlight and item new. Item identifier flashlight, and we'll call this a sleek and modern flashlight. All right. So what this means then, though, is we have to come up here. We have to put some impl on item. So we will have a ID on item and a description, which will just be a string. And so how am I doing this on these others? I just put a string in. Right. And so ID and description and voila. Okay, so there's our constructor for our item. And so we have one item that's in the catalog of available items for the game, right? This is not what the player has. This is just what the game is going to define overall, right? Because items are going to be associated with locations, with rooms, and the player can have a collection of item identifiers, right? So actually should not be a collection of items, it should be a collection of their IDs. Because again, we want to think about ownership, right? This is primitive data. This is like an integer of some size. This is copyable. This is clonable. This is hashable. This kind of thing is easily manipulated and moved around in memory, and Rust is not going to give us a hard time about adding, removing, deleting, those values from an items collection. And then we can always, because everything's going to be in the interactive story, we can always get the get the actual object for that item pretty easily, right? So, okay, so that's done. And when we set the room, the starting room here now, and then define rooms hasn't changed. The room mutator has not changed. Um, I think I'm just going to get rid of that because we don't need it because everything's happening inside now, which is, again, what we want. Really think about like who owns what, who's doing what. And then we move the update header in here. So this code just stays the same for now. And surprisingly, with the exception of the window handle, so this should be header win. Right. Everything else stays pretty much the same. And then we need to look for self win, right? So this should be, so don't need to set room name like this anymore. We can just do, we can just do that. And I think we can even do that because room, yeah, just has a string on it. See, since we're not, this is where things get nice because when you're not trying to pass stuff outside of yourself, when you're not trying to push things where they don't belong, it's actually really pleasant to work with. It's when you start doing things you're not supposed to do that it gets problematic. Okay, so I was searching for win, right? So this should be story win. This should be story win. Oops. Win. Okay. And right. So let's do the player stuff. Oh yeah, location is so I'm going to set the player's room location to none for now because that's like a next step in the refactoring. All right, so let's compile that, see where we stand. Okay. Yep. So this should be player, player. Yep. And then we need to add that made move function. What is it complaining about? Right, so we need to clone it here, which is what was happening before any. Well, maybe not. Yeah, but I should be able to copy it though, right? Because this is a string. This is a string. So, and string is, oh, string is not copyable though, because it has a pointer in it. Yeah, okay. So what we're doing here, so stir, the stir type is a slice. A slice is like a pointer with a length, a start point and an end point in memory, essentially. And so what we're doing is we're taking the string, we're getting a slice from it. So this is actually a relatively efficient, this is pretty efficient, right? This is pointing directly into the blob of memory. And then we're passing that slice into from, right? And then we're making a new string struct that points at that data, right? So even though this might seem like it's doing a lot, in reality, this is pretty efficient. Um, and so let's tidy up. So max y is never being used on this. Okay, we know items is not. We know this is not. Yeah, so most of these we can ignore for now. Yep, these are harmless. I don't know why sea lion, or not sea lion. Yeah, sea lion. I don't know why sea lion flags that as being incorrect. It's not. So I'm going to add a function here called earn points. And so then this would just be self score plus the points earned. No. What is move? U32. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why it is complaining about that, but not that. Go figure. Um, okay, so now the location, right? So we have room here, but really that's on player now, right? Um, because the player is in a location, not the story. I mean, the story again, it depends on how you. Uh, a lot of stuff ends up being subjective at some point, but um, yeah. So everywhere where we're putting room on the actual interactive story, it's now something we're going to do to the player. And again, this is really should be painless because it's a copyable. Oh no, it's not room, it's location. Let's get that right. Yeah, okay. So this is going to be player location, and this is going to be player location, and player location. So player location, yeah, this is feeling much, much nicer already. Makes much more sense. There we go. All right. So, oops. Helps if I can type. So let's run it. Oh, interesting. The name is off. Right. Um, so if I go west or east, no. Interesting. East. Are we because what are we not doing? Because we're not updating. We're not updating room name. Yep. We set it. Oh no, we are. Okay. So, okay. Yeah. Do we need to do it that way? Or can we just in the header, because we know what the player's location is, let's just get the room instead of trying to copy the string, right? And this is just going to be room name then at that point. Yeah, it's kind of silly to duplicate state like that. So then the question is, am I using this in here anywhere? I don't think I am. No, I am. I'm using it right here because we got to get the description. Okay, yeah, so we don't need to set room name anymore. Okay. There we go. Look at that. And we're not even having to worry about copying strings and all that nonsense. And the whole void thing, we don't have to do the initialization like that anymore. So if I do look, if I do east, no, west, there we go, west. Yep. Oh, no, okay, that's interesting. It still says grimy and dark hotel room. Okay, so the room is changing, but a couple things are happening. Oh, I know why. We forgot to call update header. We're never calling update header. Yeah, nobody's calling it. Okay, so so let's just change look at room to call update header. Because that's the thing that we're always going to call, right? Look at room is kind of the center point to the interface of this. Okay, so if I do a look, if I say east, no, if I go west, boom, there we go. Now we're in the hallway, and if I go east, we're back in the hotel room, and I've done 2 moves. All right, so, we're right at 45-ish minutes. So I'm going to cut it there. Let's review what we've got. So we pulled in the standard vector because we're using that now for some collections of items and things. We have one item identifier, a flashlight. We're gonna add many more. We have a struct for items, and again, I think this is going to become more complex. But to start off with, we just have the identifier and we have the description on it. And then our impl on the struct, we just have a constructor method that makes a new item based on what gets passed in. We created a player. So we used to have moves and score and location on the different windows, but doesn't really make sense, right? The player makes moves, the player has a score, the player has a location, the player has a collection of item identifiers that they're holding in their inventory. And then so on the impl for the player, we have a constructor. And so we just set score and moves to 0. We create a new empty vector for our inventory. And we set our initial location to none, right? And then we have a couple helper methods here, right? Mutators. Hey, I made a move, right? So the interactive story, anytime the player makes a move, we just call this, it increments the move count, done. And then if we score something, we make points, then we can call earned points and add those points to the score. So we renamed story window to interactive story, right? We're going to make it a little bit more abstract now. It's going to start becoming more of a real thing. And so we have the windowing max X and Y stuff. We have the player on here now. We still have our input state pieces, right? We have the game title. We have the 2 window handles now, the 2 ncurses Windows handles, one for the story window, which is that bottom part, one for the header window. And then we have a collection of item definitions, right? So this is a hash map, just like our room hash map. This defines the items that are, this is like, you can think of this as the description of the item entities in the game. This is the description of the room entities in the game. This is a description of the items. And there's going to be, like, rooms will have, items will be placed in rooms and things like that, right? So that's coming. So on our interactive story implementation, right, our constructor now kind of consolidates both the header window and the story window into one thing now. So we initialize our player, we initialize our item hash map, we initialize the header window inside here now because all that's consolidated. We set the game title inside because the interactive story knows what the title of it is. And we changed the name of the win to story win, right? So these are just renames here. We added 2 new methods, one called Initialize. So from the outside world now, when we set up the interactive story, we just call Initialize. And Initialize calls define items, and define rooms and sets the player's location. Also, we don't, the interactive story doesn't have that room on it anymore. Now the player has a location within the story. Where is the player at? And for define items right now, it's really simple. We just insert the flashlight into the map, and it's just really kind of a placeholder. So we have it there, and it'll give us a toehold so that we can build on top of it. We didn't change anything with the rooms. When we do look at room now, so again, look at room is this thing that puts the description, in the story window, and so we also now just call update header along with that. Because the header is all inside of the header and the story window are all inside the interactive story, and that just makes everything super easy. So instead of using the room field, we're now going to the player and saying, hey, what's your location? And we use that to look up the room. And this is just changing the name. This was just changing the name. Moving, we have to look up the location from the player. Same thing here. So update header, this was the update method on the header impl before, the header window impl. Now we just move that in here. And instead of having a separate string that is the room name that goes in the header, because the header didn't have access, it was a mess, right? So now we just look up the room again because we it's easy. We have access to the collection. It's on ourself, and we know what the player's location is, so we can just look it up, right? And we can get any attributes about the room, the location that we need. And so we use that to put the title up there at the top. There's still a bug here. We'll fix that in the next episode. And we call update header, actually this is superfluous. We don't need that anymore. So let's take that out. Because look at room does that for us now. See, this is why you always, review your code. It doesn't take that long, and you catch stuff. Okay, so let's go back to that. Right, okay, and so these are just renames. I think the vast majority of the renames. So the location is now in the player, and when we want to track moves, we just call made move on the player, and then that handles changing the player's move count and all that. These are just renames. These are just, I put spaces in here. And then in our main method, things simplified, right? So now instead of having to create a header window and passing that in, which is kind of a big no-no in Rust, we just create an interactive story, we initialize it, and we run it. But it's called story window. So let's fix that. One last thing here. Yeah. So it's just a story now. And, yep. Okay, looks good. Refactor. Ooh, there's occasionally some stray characters end up in there, and eventually we're going to have to fix the parser, but not a huge priority at the moment. Okay, so let's just double check that. Yep, that looks good. I'm going to yeah, that's good. So push that up. That's up on GitHub. And that gets us right to an hour. So not too bad. All right. So in our next episode, what we're going to do is let me just look at my cheat sheet here. We're going to work on, because to really start fleshing out the game now, we need to simplify defining items and rooms and the relationship to them. We need to simplify defining the story, right? And this is pretty verbose. So we need to find a way to do this in a cleaner way. So in our next episode, I want to investigate using macros in Rust to make this, to leverage code generation so that we can define our story um, in a nice kind of meaningful fashion and not just have thousands and thousands of lines of cut and pasted object creation code. This is what will actually end up getting created behind the scenes, but we don't want to have to actually look at that because we're going to have a lot of text and other things. Plus, we want to be able to associate items to rooms. We want to have behavior, right? So rooms and items need to have things associated to them, right? So we're going to have to introduce some traits so that, like when you enter a room, we could have triggers. So if you enter a room for the first time, there could be a trigger. If you leave a room, whatever, we could have a timer running in the background where something's happening in parallel to what you're doing. And that executes. So every time you make a move in the game, that's a unit of time in the world. And anything that's on a timer also can make a move, right? Um, so we need to, potentially start introducing those concepts and to tell a story, to tell a convincing story and have it be, sufficiently interactive and fun to play. We need a way of being able to quickly and easily define kind of complex relationships with different entities in the story without it being a huge pain in the butt. So that'll be the next episode. I think is looking at that, getting at least the first step um, of how that's going to look and how that's going to work. So I think that'll do it. And thanks for watching. This is YouTube only. So if you like this, please give it a like, share it, subscribe on YouTube. I would appreciate it. If you would like to watch me on Twitch, I stream Monday through Saturday, 5 a.m. to 10 a.m. Mountain Time. My channel is twitch.tv/nybbles.io, nybbles.io. I archive all of my Twitch streams here on YouTube, so if you want to watch them, you can definitely catch them here. And yeah, that'll do it. Have a good one. Bye.